This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 40 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about how to stop yelling at your students. I'll start right away by admitting I have done my fair share of yelling. As a middle school teacher, I wasn't too bad. I probably had one good yell per week. As a parent, though, much more. So I know the struggle. In this episode, I'm going to share some ideas that can help you cut back on your yelling. Now, if you're listening to this show for the very first time, I'll introduce myself real quick. My name is Jennifer Gonzalez. I was a middle school language arts teacher for 7 years, which I absolutely loved. I left the classroom for what I thought was a few years to stay home with my kids. I've got 3 of those. For a couple of years, I did only baby-related things, but then I started teaching pre-service teachers at the college level. Over the next 4 years, I learned more about teaching than I'd ever known as a classroom teacher, and I completely fell in love with helping teachers get better at their jobs. I started taking graduate classes in educational technology. And then in 2013, I started my website, Cult of Pedagogy, where I now work full-time to help educators improve the work they do. I look at instructional techniques, classroom management, relationship building technology, classroom design, and I also review books on education-related topics. If you've never been to the site, set aside an hour and go to cultofpedagogy.com. If you are as crazy about teaching as I am, I promise you will not be disappointed. Also, I want to thank those of you who have left a review for this podcast on iTunes. I go over to my iTunes page about once a week to see if any new reviews have been posted, and I am so grateful for what you have written there. Not only does it motivate me completely to keep working hard on this podcast, but I think it really helps draw in new people to check out the show. So thank you so much. After listening to this episode, if you want to check out some of the resources I mentioned, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of other articles and videos and books and all that stuff, just go over to cultofpedagogy.com, click on the thing on the menu that says podcast, and then go to episode 40. That'll take you straight to the blog post associated with this episode. And it'll have links to everything, plus a neat little cartoon I drew of a yelling teacher. Okay, so let's get started talking about yelling. Like I said before, I struggle with yelling, more as a parent than I did as a teacher, but I definitely had problems as a teacher too. And I know a lot of you struggle too. Now, I'm recording this right before April of 2016, and so we are getting into that time of year when everybody is just getting really stressed out. So I thought this would be a good time to talk about this topic. Even if you are a great teacher, even if you're a swell person most days, sometimes it all gets to be too much and you just snap. I remember the teacher in the room next to me one year, a person I completely adored. This teacher had a perfectly fine relationship with our students, but once or twice a week, I could hear through the walls. Often it was accompanied by the slam of a classroom door, and it just turned my blood to ice. If my students and I happened to be doing something quiet, we would all kind of freeze up listening to it. It never lasted long, but I always felt bad for my colleague during those moments. I knew a switch had been tripped, and it wasn't this person's normal way of dealing with students. And if this person was anything like me, they probably felt pretty awful when it was all over. Once the moment has passed and I've had my little tantrum, I'm ashamed of the spectacle I have made. Losing control is not a proud moment for anyone. But I have gotten a lot better in recent years. Not 100% better, but better. And I want to share what has worked for me, along with some research and ideas from other people who have also cut way back on their yelling. So before you can really cut down on your yelling, you need to understand why yelling is not a good thing and why it's important to stop. So here are a couple of reasons why you need to stop yelling. First is, it is crappy role modeling. Even if we accomplish nothing else in a school day, the least we can do is demonstrate a respectable level of self-control for our students. Part of our job is to show them how to handle anger, stress, and conflict in a healthy and productive way. We can't just tell them to do that. We have to show them. And yelling is definitely not showing them healthy, productive stress management. Second reason is it trains students to ignore your regular voice. When your go-to strategy for handling negative situations is yelling, students ultimately tune out all of your other voice levels. In his article, 10 Reasons Why You Should Never Ever Yell at Students, educator Michael Linson explains it this way. He says, when you yell, you train your students to listen to you only when you raise your voice. In other words, they learn that unless you're shouting, you must not really mean it. So yelling begets more yelling, which may in turn make them immune to even the garden variety yelling. So you have to keep upping the volume and intensity to get their attention. That is just a horrible, slippery slope you need to back away from. The third reason you need to stop yelling is that it gets in the way of student responsibility. There is an Australian study done in 2001, and they found that when students have teachers who use more coercive, aggressive behavior management techniques, like yelling, they report being less likely to act responsibly in that class. This makes sense to me because in those classes, students are acting more out of compliance and fear than out of any intrinsic desire to be responsible. So if you believe it's part of your job to raise mature, conscientious humans, just know that yelling at them will only slow that process down. Another reason to cut back on yelling is that students are less likely to respect you when you yell. Now, this is a study on parenting, but I believe it's got a strong link to teaching. When adolescents are raised by authoritarian parents, whose methods are punitive, coercive, and often include yelling, they are less likely to view their parents as legitimate authority figures than kids whose parents have different styles. This is from a study done in 2012 in the Journal of Adolescence. Now, because parenting and teaching involve similar skill sets, I think it's reasonable to assume that students who have authoritarian teachers feel the same way about them. Now, this may sound ironic to teachers who tend to yell a lot because they may feel that the students respect them because they straighten up and they follow instructions right away when the yelling happens. But the obedience that you might get from yelling, it might look like respect, but that behavior probably doesn't match their true feelings for you. So if you want legitimate respect, the yelling has to go away. Another reason to cut down on yelling is that it may contribute to bullying. The way students treat one another has become a major concern for educators in recent years. We tend to look at programs that aim to change student behavior and attitudes, but our own conduct may be a contributing factor. A 2010 study found that classrooms where the teacher used that same authoritarian style, using punishment and coercion to influence student behavior, it created an environment where bullying behavior between students was more likely to develop. Now, this is one of the lines from the study. Bullying doesn't occur in a vacuum. A host of factors contribute to its existence, and one of them is how teachers manage their classrooms and respond to inappropriate student behavior. So if you're concerned about bullying in your school, one other place to look for why that may be occurring is the way that you interact with your students, and yelling may be a part of that. Finally, the final reason, we're just getting into the reasons right now to stop, and then we'll talk about the techniques you can use to actually stop, is that it creates anxiety for everyone. Now, for this one, I don't think any research is needed. When you yell in anger, it changes the feeling in the room. Not just for the kid you're yelling at, but for everyone within earshot. That includes the teachers and students in nearby classrooms. If you just take a quick glance at your handy Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that'll tell you that the need for safety for all humans, it comes way, way before the desire to satisfy any kind of cognitive or creative interests. So if your students are preoccupied by an awful, tense feeling in the room, they're much less able to do quality academic work. So ultimately, if you're a big yeller, it's going to impact your students' work academically. So those are just the reasons why it's a good idea to cut back on yelling, because sometimes it helps to understand why you should even bother. Not good role modeling. Train students to ignore all of your regular voice things, the times you use your regular voice. It gets in the way of student responsibility. Students are less likely to respect you. It could contribute to bullying, and it just creates anxiety for everyone. So we're going to look at 2 different categories of techniques that can help you actually cut back. The first set are preventative. These are things that you can do to prevent the yells before they even start. The first one of these is knowing your triggers. Not everyone yells for the same reasons, so it's important to learn what triggers you and then notice the early warning signs. Like I mentioned earlier, yelling has been one of my biggest parenting struggles. And 11 years into it, I have grown acutely aware of the things that set me off. Sticky surfaces, excessive noise, and kids getting all up in my grill when they want attention. I flail around just to make it all go away. It's not pretty. On good days, though, I'm able to notice the first glimmers of irritation caused by these things. Kind of face them as soon as they turn up, and then make a mental note not to let them build to a big yelling outburst. So just start paying attention to the things that set you off and see if you can catch these feelings in their early stages. The second way that you can prevent yelling before it starts is to just do regular check-ins with yourself. This is kind of similar to knowing your triggers, but it's a little bit more broad. One reason I yell is because I've gotten out of touch with how I'm feeling. I let some kind of resentment or a frustration from earlier in the day, or maybe even hunger, build up past the point where I could control it in a rational manner. If this sounds familiar to you, start building regular self-checks into your daily schedule. On a regular basis, maybe once an hour on the hour, take a moment to just notice how you're feeling, both physically and emotionally. Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 in both mood and physical comfort. And if you find you're heading below a 5 on either scale, do something to remedy that before you sink down closer to 1, where your lizard brain is far more likely to take over and turn you into a big jerk. In her Psychology Today article called 10 Steps to Stop Yelling, Dr. Laura Markham uses the term kindling to describe the resentments you start to pile up when you're having a bad day. Once you have enough kindling, a firestorm is inevitable. The only way to prevent that firestorm is to recognize when a pile of kindling is growing in a certain situation or against a particular person, and do something about it before lighting the match. Have a calm conversation with someone about the problem while you have your head on straight. You will definitely thank yourself later. The third way to prevent yelling before it starts is to examine your thoughts, then revise them. Chances are good that the root of your yelling is coming from a set of beliefs you keep repeating to yourself. You just may not be aware of them. Here's an example. One thing that sets me off with my own kids is when I tell them to clean up a room and they just kind of chill. Like, they don't get up, they don't move, they act almost like they can't even hear me. Now, if I were to look carefully at my thoughts during these moments, I think I would see something like this. They don't respect me. Look at how they just keep doing exactly what they're doing as if they didn't even hear me. Kids who actually respect their parents would get up immediately. They would follow instructions immediately. But they don't even take me seriously. I'll show them, and then I start yelling. The same thing happened when I was a teacher. In my first few years of teaching, I had a colleague, I'll call him George, who would regularly stop by my classroom to reprimand my students if they were misbehaving. The kids would straighten up and he'd head out and everything would be taken care of, except I was basically humiliated. I felt weak and ineffective and embarrassed. And within the next 60 seconds, guaranteed, I would be yelling at my kids over some small infraction. My ego had been bruised, and I felt like all the other teachers thought I was a pushover. So I was going to show them. I'd show everyone, and the yelling would get started. The American Psychological Association recommends that we control our anger with something called cognitive restructuring. I'm going to quote from an article that they wrote about what this means. What is cognitive restructuring? Simply put, this means changing the way you think. When you're angry, your thinking can get very exaggerated and overly dramatic. Try replacing these thoughts with more rational ones. For instance, instead of telling yourself, oh, it's awful, it's terrible, everything's ruined, tell yourself, it's frustrating and it's understandable that I'm upset about it, but it's not the end of the world and getting angry is not going to fix it anyhow. I have personally found this to be an incredibly powerful way to diffuse my own anger. So think about the things you tell yourself that lead you to yell. Are you regularly ruminating over how disrespectful students are these days? Are you furious about the impossible pressures placed on you by standardized testing? Do you believe certain students make it their mission to sneak, lie, and cheat their way through life? Do you resent the fact that you're having to teach students whose learning or language needs go beyond your training? Sit with those thoughts and feelings a while. Listen to them long enough to be very clear on the scripts they're playing in your head. Then see what you can do about rewriting them. If you'd like more examples of how cognitive restructuring can work for teachers, I have actually reviewed a book written by my friend Angela Watson called Unshakable: 20 Ways to Enjoy Teaching Every Day, No Matter What. And the chapter that I focused on in my review of it was called Rewrite the Story You Tell Yourself About Teaching. And there's a link to that in the blog post. Just go to cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and go to episode 40. That book does an excellent job of explaining how you can restructure the way you're thinking about your work to make it a lot more enjoyable. And this would definitely be a great strategy for diffusing that urge to yell. So, a couple of strategies for preventing yelling. We've got knowing your triggers, doing regular check-ins with yourself so that you're monitoring your feelings a little bit better, examining your thoughts and revising them. And then the last one that I feel is an important one for preventing that yelling from happening is from my own personal experience, and I'm calling it watch the multitasking. When I am attempting to do something that requires concentration and one of my kids needs my attention, I am way more likely to snap at them. It's really tempting to try to squeeze two tasks into one space, say entering your grades into your gradebook while your students read silently. But suppose your gradebook software freezes right in the middle of it, and you realize the last 10 grades you entered just disappeared. And right then, you notice that one of your students is kicking the desk of the girl in front of him, and it's bothering her. You're already stressed by the gradebook situation, and now Bart Simpson over there is causing problems. Are you going to handle this well? Are you going to quietly go over him and tell him to stop and then deliver a consequence calmly if he does it again? I seriously doubt it. If we are anything like each other, you are more likely to flip out because you were trying to get something else done, it wasn't going well, and now you're dealing with this kid. So, choose your secondary tasks wisely. Sure, if your students are working quietly and you want to file a few papers, fine. I know it, I get it, you've got a lot to do. Just make sure it's an interruption-friendly task, something that doesn't require a lot of concentration. Because if you choose something complex or something that could give you problems, you're far more likely to see students as an annoying distraction. So, those are the preventative strategies. What about when you get that yelling feeling, you feel it coming, and you've done everything you can to prevent the desire to yell, and it's on its way anyway? Here are some things you can do to fight it face to face. The first one is get closer. About 6 years into my life as a new parent, it suddenly dawned on me that one of the main reasons I yelled at my kids was because I didn't have the energy to physically go to where they were. I was worn out and I didn't feel like getting up. Or I had my hands in the sink and a problem erupted somewhere. So instead of drying off and going to deal with it, I yelled. On her blog, Lemon Lime Adventures, Dana Abraham captured this epiphany perfectly in her post called One Simple Tip to Help You Stop Yelling, and this is how she describes it. When the kids start to get ramped up, instead of yelling from across the room to settle down, I get closer. When the kids are starting to argue, instead of yelling above their voices to get along, I get closer. When the kids are ignoring my requests, instead of yelling my requests louder, I get closer. So one way to head off your yelling is to just physically move yourself to where they are, where the problem is. Not only will that proximity get their attention, it will make yelling basically unnecessary if you're that close. So get closer. That's one technique. Another technique is, instead of loud and ranty, go for quiet and concise. When you have the urge to yell, make a conscious effort to go in the opposite direction. Speak much more softly, almost in a whisper. This can actually get students' attention even more effectively than a yell. More importantly, it projects self-control. Now, I just saw a great Periscope broadcast the other day by a special ed teacher named Amy Harris, and she was talking about dealing with explosive behavior in your students and how to stay calm. And here's what she said. We are the adults in the situation. These are kids we're talking about, so we can't try to get into a shouting match with them. She also recommended using as few words as possible rather than delivering a long lecture. She says the more you limit your words, the less you're going to get into a power struggle. She was talking about how kids, when they are stressed out, only hear about 5 words before they start to tune out. So it's really important to choose your words carefully, use very few, tell students what you want instead of going on and on about what they're doing wrong. So go for quiet voice and very few words. Another thing you can do when you get that yelling feeling is to find a replacement. And in this section on the blog post, I've got a lot of different suggestions. If you're just trying to get the room quiet, just look for an alternative. I'm linking to 2 separate blog posts, 15 creative and respectful ways to quiet a class. This is also from Angela Watson. I refer to her stuff a lot. She suggests countdowns, hand signals, asking a content-related question to refocus students' attention. I linked to another one. This is from Todd Finley on Edutopia, 30 techniques to quiet a noisy class. One of them I thought was interesting was where the teacher just turns and starts writing a note to the class on the board. And you need to go and read it, but it specifies exactly what students should do by the time he's done writing. It's really interesting. Now, my own go-to strategy, my own replacement for yelling when I really wanted to blow up was to just grab a notebook, sit down, and start writing. I would write in a notebook. The kids had no idea what I was writing about. Sometimes I was writing about how terrible I thought everything was. I ended up turning it into kind of a system where I would start really recording what was going on in the room, and it would help me to not get so upset. I would actually record the names of the students who were behaving. And suddenly noticing that really, really became very helpful because I realized it wasn't everybody. It was just a few kids. So I described that in a video that I linked to on the post. But if you are not the clicking on online type, just that was a really helpful strategy when I felt like I was losing control, was to just sit down and write. And it would get the class pin drop silent because they were really confused about why their teacher had stopped trying to teach and was just sitting there writing. So other strategies for replacing the yelling are to repeat a mantra in your head. You can step outside your room. You can count to 10. The point of this replacement one is that if you have made a commitment to not yell, you will find whatever trick you need that works for you. So if you're going to yell, see if you can find a way to replace it. And then the last ditch strategy for if that yelling feeling is coming on and you don't know what to do. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this one, but I figure it might help somebody else. So if nothing else works, I will pretend I'm being filmed for a reality show. I ask myself if I'm behaving in a way I would be proud of later, and that can occasionally stop me in my tracks despite the actual lack of a camera. I used to watch a lot of John and Kate Plus 8 and be horrified sometimes by her. And I remember all of that watching kind of gave me a heightened awareness. I remember thinking, what would I do if I had a camera following me around all the time? And so occasionally I would sort of pretend that was happening, and it got me to behave a little bit better. So, you got to do what works. Okay, so the last bit of advice I would like to give you in terms of the whole process of trying to cut back on your yelling is to track your progress. Success with dropping any kind of a bad habit can be reinforced if you track your progress. My yelling with my own kids got so bad at one point, I actually had to set myself a concrete goal with a reward at the end of it. Here's what I did. If I could be yell-free for 2 solid weeks, I would buy myself a nice new pair of boots. So I made a no yelling chart to check off each yell-free day. I taped it to a kitchen cabinet, and I showed it to my kids so they could keep me honest. Each time I blew it, which I did twice, I had to start over with a new chart and a fresh new 2 weeks. After I finally got through 2 full weeks and I stopped tracking, I would occasionally slip back into my old yelling habit, but my awareness of it had grown significantly, and that is what stuck. And now I know that if I ever start getting really bad again, I can always work toward another new pair of boots. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, go to cultofpedagogy.com/pod and click on episode 40. Thanks for listening and have a great day. This podcast is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. To learn more, visit edupodcastnetwork.com.